Well, hello to everybody who's joining. My name is Randy Syring. I am the Chief Executive Developer of a software consulting company called Level 12. Chief Executive Developer is just my way of saying that I'm the CEO, but I still try to have my hands in development as much as I can. It can be challenging at this stage of the game. We're about 5 years into software development full-time. Before that, we had some other computer networking stuff that we did. I've been personally doing software development professionally since 2004. So I guess that puts me going on 16 years. In addition, I've been doing Python since 2007, end of 2007. I got into Python originally. I was originally doing PHP, and all of this has been web development. Almost my entire experience has been web development and or analytics. I got into Python because I was just having problems with bugs in PHP, the language, and got a bit disappointed with the language as a whole. And at that time, Google came out with Google App Engine, and the first language that they supported was Python. And I respected Google's software engineering prowess and thought if they felt like investing in Python as their first language was beneficial, then it would be beneficial for me to look at it. I started looking into it. I started using it, and I've never gone back. I think Python is a joy to develop in. It often allows me to focus on the business problem and just kind of the language gets out of my way. It's expressive, and I really enjoy that. So I'm happy to be doing the tutorial today. Interestingly enough, when I started, the reason I'm doing Flask, I know you got Flask, Django, and Pyramid these days, I believe, as some of the major web frameworks in Python. There's also Falcon, I believe, is another one that I'm familiar with. One of the reasons I'm involved in Flask and probably not Django is because when I started back in 2008 or 2007, I think when I started, Django was still pre 1.0, and I had a large client that used Microsoft SQL Server, and at the time, Django's support for Microsoft SQL Server was a bit sketchy. And so at that time, I jumped in and basically created my own framework from WorkZug, which existed at the time. And when I got done doing that, we used that for about 5 years. Flask kind of got started, and then it was an easier transition from Flask than it was to Django. The other main reason that that I've focused on Flask is because in our applications with our customers, we often have a lot of database interaction. I would say that the majority of our apps are probably, the complexity is probably 60 to 70% in just database queries and structure. And so we have found that SQLAlchemy is a superior ORM. It gives us the flexibility and the expressiveness that we need. Again, not bashing Django, just a different use case. And a lot of the benefit that you get from Django in terms of the admin interfaces and stuff that are created automatically that's not where our main need is. And so we found that Flask and Flask-SQLAlchemy together, it just makes, just helps us be really productive for our clients and focus on their business problems. So that's why I'm talking about Flask today, because we use it primarily. That's what we use in my work environment, and I'm most familiar with it and glad to share. I think Flask is really easy to get into. The Flask Hello World is basically instantiate the app and create your view, use the decorator app.route, and you're off to the races. And unlike Django, which has a lot of how can I say how the difference? Like, I think that Django, there's a lot more done for you. They've already figured out the way to do it. With Flask, there's a lot of tools there, but you have to figure out how am I going to structure the app. And so the main point of my talk today is just to show, as we've developed Flask apps over the last 5 to 7 years, I'm just going to show some of the patterns that I've picked up that have helped me do more advanced Flask applications. And I'll talk about some of the features of those applications. I do want to point out, now that we've got hopefully some more people here, that I've created a channel in the Python Web Conference Slack called Flask Beyond HW. There's a link to that in the track too. Go ahead and join that if you're interested in asking questions or pointing things out, commenting. Please join that. It's a little bit, I find it a little bit disconcerting to have this be kind of a one-way discussion. And so I am going to try to pay attention to the Slack channel. If you're one of those people that would like to raise your hand or ask for clarification or just add a comment, and you do that in the course of a normal conference, I would love that. So how I'd ask you to use the Slack channel is, if you're just having a discussion amongst yourselves, go ahead and keep that in track too. But if you want to interact with me, then put that in Flask Beyond Hello World channel, and I will do my best to interact with that, answer questions, or get some dialogue going there. So the first thing that I want to ask, if you're interested in participating, is just throw out there. I'd like to know, for those of you who are who are professional software developers, or you're doing software development as part of your job, I got 2 questions for you, and that is, A, do you use Flask in your environment, or are you learning it new? And then the second question is, do you do automated testing professionally? And if so, how much of your applications are covered by tests? 20%, 50%, 100%. I won't go into tests too much in this talk, but I really care about automated testing, and I usually like to ask the audience as kind of a icebreaker how they're used to doing automated testing, if at all, in their environments. So go ahead and post in the Flask Beyond Hello World and let me know your experience with both Flask and automated testing. Okay, so I think that clarifies it. So the other thing I want to point out is, in the Slack channel, I've also put a GitHub repo, a link to a GitHub repo called Flog2. Flog2 is a Flask application that is exactly what I'm going to walk through here when I share my screen. It's all there. It works. There's tests. There's CLI. It's all put together. So one of the things that I've kind of struggled with in terms of presenting topics is, if you want to cover a lot of material, you usually can't go very deep in implementation, or it just takes too long and people get lost. So this talk in particular is going to be more an introduction to ideas. I do have the code. We will review some of the code together, but it's going to be more of an overview of how I structure an app, why I do the things that I do, with the intention that if I miss some of the implementation, you have it there in the repo to go review. You've got tests that run. You've got CI set up. So it's all there. You could even use that for a template. I built it to try to be that way, so that if you wanted to start your own application for using some of these principles, that you could just grab the app and use it. I don't have it set up as a cookie cutter, but essentially as a cookie cutter, as a template. So I'm probably going to stay more high level, maybe jump around in the code just a bit to show how some of it is wired together. But in general, I intend for this to be high level, more about why I do things this way, and to make you aware that of these concepts, that they're out there, so that you can then go review later and dig deeper if you want to. Just reviewing some of the Slack comments here. Okay, so we got some people moving to Flask. We got some people 60 to 70% test coverage, some with few tests. That's about what I'm used to. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, I'm assuming that you're all sharing my screen or can see it. If something's not looking right here, sorry, give me just a second. I'm going to try to. Zoom's bar is just right in the way. That's so annoying. Normally I can move it. Give me just a second here. Technical difficulties. All right. There we go. All right, we'll try to keep it there. All right. Let's see, make this a bit bigger. Okay, let me know in Slack if anybody is if anybody's not seeing the screen or it's not big enough. The text is not big enough. So the first thing that I want to point out here, let me get another window up here. Okay, so the first thing I want to show here is that I find it incredibly satisfying as a developer when the first thing I see in a README is how do I get the application up and running with the tests. So not only do I see here that CI is set up and passing and that code coverage is there, that gives me a sense of confidence that the developers care about code coverage and testing because I can see them right there in front of me. But then also, how do I get into this project myself? How do I get it actually running? And so I usually make that the very first part of the application for me is of the README is to just say, hey, if you want to check out this code, you should be able to get it up and running really easy. I see somebody's posting some errors in the Slack channel. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to help you troubleshoot that, but I'd be happy to follow up with you on that later. So I just wanted to say, like, I think this is really satisfying as a developer to have this type of paradigm where, as developers, we're setting up CI and talks and the README to make it really easy for other developers to jump in and run tests. And the reason that's helpful for me is because when I know the tests are running 100%, then I know they're 100% passing. I know that if I go in and I make any changes, it's me. I've broken it. And so I've been on projects before where I spend hours trying to set up the environment, and then even then I might have a handful of tests that fail, and I'm not sure if like that's expected. I'm not sure if that's my fault. I'm not sure if it's maybe a difference between my environment and CI. And so by having all of this kind of together in the README, by having CI passing, I understand that the person who built this project is expressing an intent that the tests should be passing. And they're doing that by showing me that the CI is passing. And then they're also showing me that running tests is a really good first step in understanding the project. And so I find that helpful. I try to preach that whenever I have the opportunity. So that's I'm not going to say much more about that. Just know that getting the test started is usually usually a high priority for our projects. The second thing here is we have used Docker Compose for the service dependencies. In this case, I think I had RabbitMQ in there, but yeah, but I didn't end up using it because I think there's going to be too much material here to cover. But I find it incredibly helpful to have Docker Compose set up to set up my service dependencies. We used to have all the developers would install those dependencies on their local machines, and it just created a lot of hassle. And so Docker Compose is definitely helpful there. The third thing I would say is we do freeze our requirements here. So if you look at my requirements file, you'll know that there's my requirements.in file. You'll notice that there's no version specifications here. But if you open up requirements.txt, there is. So there is a tool called pip compile, which comes from the pip tools repository. And the reason that we freeze our dependencies is so that we don't have bugs accidentally cropping in because upstream changed things. So if you look at our tox file, you'll see that we actually test both versions of the requirements files. We test the one that's unversioned and we test the one that is versioned. And the reason for that is I want to know in CI if upstream has released a breaking change, but I also want to have a sense of stability. And so the requirements.txt file, which is the one that has the versions, this is actually the one that we deploy with. So we're always deploying the same versions of our dependencies that we're deploying, that we're testing with. At the same time, CI can go ahead and download everything fresh from PyPy and give me a heads up if something is broken and I don't realize it. Okay, any questions or comments related to just those few introductory comments in terms of freezing requirements, using Docker, or the ease of getting started with testing and development environments? Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is the app factory pattern. Let's go to so in Flask, when you have a quick start, this is so simple. Like this is so easy. The reality is that this pattern of having a single app instance that's loaded at the module level ends up becoming problematic as your app grows. So Flask has come up with, I guess they haven't come up with, but they use a factory pattern to initiate, to start up, to create your applications. So I just want to briefly touch on that and show how that works. So I've created this Flask subclass here, and it's a little bit different. So normally what you would see when Flask recommends the application factory, they recommend just an application, they recommend a function called create app. It doesn't really matter what you call it. I like to hang this thing here off of the class, because eventually this whole application kind of pattern here, I'm gonna put into a subclass, and so it's easier to find this if I know that it's on the class. So this is how I instantiate the application. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but I have this create class method on here that can be called. One of the nice things about this is it gives you time after you load the module, the Python module. The app isn't initially instantiated. And what you're going to find is that that's actually really helpful when you have certain things that you need to do, like initialize some other extensions, or when sometimes you have competing imports, you end up in import cycles where, for instance, if I had my app just initialized right here on this line, app equals, flask.flask, whatever. If I just did this, but I also had some blueprints, which we're going to talk about, that I needed to import from my views file. And then my views file also needed the database to work, which this is often the case. So I'd have another line here, like it'd be db equals Flask-SQLAlchemy dot SQLAlchemy, like this. I think something like this. It doesn't matter the details, but essentially I have to feed the app to this. But the problem is, to instantiate the app, I have to go find the blueprint, which means I have to load the view, but the view needs to try to get the database. So it's going to come back here and it's not going to find it because the app's still going to be trying to instantiate. So without taking too much time to show that, just know that circular dependencies can be a problem. And the pattern that I'm showing here, one of the reasons that I use this pattern is to try to avoid circular dependencies. Okay. So that the question becomes, okay, if in this model of app instantiation, we have access to the app right here, we use it to set up our routes and our views. Well, what do you do when you're relying on some other mechanism to actually instantiate the application? How do you associate your views or your other application infrastructure to the app if you don't actually have the app instance yet? That is, what I mean by that is, I have to associate all this stuff together before the app itself is actually instantiated. So the method that Flask has given us for that is blueprints. So there's a whole section of documentation here on blueprints. There's also the application factory pattern is also described here in the Flask documentation if you want to read more about that. So a blueprint is essentially a declarative way of still defining your routes or other resources without having the app available. And that's what I'm doing here. So this is an example of a blueprint. This is for my views. I've only created one. Again, we're not going to go too deep into implementation. But this essentially gives me an object where this view is associated with this public blueprint option object. So I could create a bunch of these. I could also potentially have a different library, like one that I would install from PyPy that uses blueprints, and then my application could use that library's blueprint. So the whole idea here, again, is to be able to set up a series of resources, whether they be views or CLI commands or templates or static information. All of that stuff can be kind of packaged up into one of these blueprints, and then that blueprint can be used by multiple applications in the current process or distributed as a library and used by multiple applications for different purposes. So thinking about this in terms of, for instance, like an administrative interface for users, user login, user management, password reset, like how many apps do you know that need all of that stuff? Well, you could set all of that up in a blueprint, publish it on PyPy or maybe locally to your, your local, if your job has a local PyPy server or a way of distributing packages, you could just build that once and then share it across a bunch of applications instead of having to kind of redo it in the same way for every application. So that's what blueprints are. They're a way to package up resources and assign them to apps. So you'll notice here that I import flog.views, which is this file, and I'm going to grab this public attribute, and down here in the init method, in the init blueprints method, I'm gonna register that right here. So that's how I associate, right there is how I associate the app instance, which is, in this case, that's self. Self is the app instance. We'll talk about how that gets created here in just a little bit. I've got another blueprint I'm grabbing from the CLI, module. And I'll talk about that as well here in just a second. So blueprints and assigning them to the application as part of the initialization process. I talked earlier about circular dependencies. One of a great way to resolve that is to put extensions, for instance, like SQLAlchemy, to put those extensions in a separate file from the file where your app is created. What this allows is the views. So if I had a view here, I would be able to do from flog.ext import db. And then I could do something down here like, db.execute select star from whatever. So that allows the view to go ahead and get a hold of the database, but it also allows the database, it also allows the app to grab the database. You'll see that we do that here from the extension file, flog.ext. It also allows us to import that and avoid the circular dependency. So offloading all extensions to a separate module is usually a good pattern for avoiding circular dependency problems. Okay, one of the other things that I like to do is I usually like to have a command on the command line that loads my application. By default, Flask has you set up some environment variables and then call the app using the Flask binary. I just like to have binaries associated with my application. It's cleaner. It feels like better better ergonomics to me. And sometimes I'm even using these techniques to ship binaries that are used by other people. So on the command line. So in this instance, I can just type flog, and I'm going to go ahead and get the application that we're building, that I'm showing you. And I'm going to walk you through quickly just how to do that. So the first thing is you have to have a setup.py that sets up this script. And so this is something that pip and setup tools handle, this console script. I got a question from Michael. He asked if in ext.py, if this database connection is instantiated at import time. The answer is no, it doesn't actually get instantiated until right here, until the init app is called. Okay, so, yep, Michael, I saw you. I just answered that. Okay, so trying to remember where I was. Oh yeah, okay, so calling the flog application. So you have to have a setup.py, and it has to have this special console scripts invocation here. The flog is the name of the binary, and this string tells Python, or I guess setup tools, when flog is called, what's the entry point into my application? Like, what is the function that's called? And so if you look at app.py, so this calls flog.app, and then you've got the CLI function. So we're in flog, we're in our app Python module, and then we're looking for the CLI callable, which is going to be this function that we're setting up right here. Now this function is we'll talk about this in a little bit. This is a CLI application that that is set up. We'll talk about that in just a second. Just know that when I call flog, this is the entry point. This code right here, along with its decorators, is the first thing that the app is going to run. And you can look up, Flask has documentation in their CLI docs about custom commands, and you can get a little bit more information on that. One of the challenges with this type of two-phase integration is that I really want the ability to set, you'll see I've got some options here. So these three are custom. These help me set the log level. And then this one, for my applications, I often want to enable Sentry when I'm running them in cron. And so I want a way to turn that on in cron and turn it off when I'm running it locally. I want those options to be at the app level, not at a command level. And in order to do that, you have to do some finagling with Flask because you've got some issues. And the issues are, A, Flask is getting its CLI commands through blueprints. And using this method, the application factory, there is a CLI blueprint here that I've created right here. And then I associate those commands with the blueprint. And in the same way, it works just like the view. I've associated those CLI commands. I have to register it to the app. The problem is you have a chicken and an egg problem. If you just initialize the whole application, there's an issue with Flask does some work. I'm trying to remember exactly how this works, but Flask does some work. You end up getting either the whole app initialized first, which, for example, prevents you from calling like right here. So this is where I get that log level and Sentry information. Log level, Sentry, I pass it into the init app. If I do all of that stuff during app creation, if I do that entire initialization, so you'll see I've got an if statement here. We'll talk about why in just a second. If I do it all, then I don't have a chance for the CLI library to actually process those arguments. So what I needed to do is I needed to set up a two-stage process whereby I can initialize just the blueprints so that Flask knows about all the commands, but then I need it to not initialize the rest of the application and wait so that I can get the value of these arguments and pass them in. So that's what I'm doing right here. I'm passing in the log level and Sentry. And so you'll notice when I create this group, this click group, I pass in a Lambda function to create the app. And I call create, but I tell it not to do the init. So this is the whole reason for the two-step process is right here in the CLI application. I want it to create the app. I don't want it to do the init. I need click to go ahead and process these options and give me them. And now I can init the rest of the app. And so regardless of what command I actually run, and you'll see I have some other commands here. I've got like this hello app or command. This group always runs first. So I can rely on click's order of operations to always run this to initialize the app before it digs down and actually runs the command like this hello command. And just so that you can see that working, flog hello. And then I'm gonna do debug, and you'll see I've got some debug output now. So debug has changed my logging level. And you'll see I have a debug statement right here. So by setting that flag, click associates the debug flag by setting flag value equals to debug. We get that as an option to the CLI command here. It's passed into init app, and init app passes that into init logging right here. So init app is called, log level is called, and that's passed into here. We're not going to go into init logging. Just know that that sets up the logging the way that I want to, and changes the root logger to debug level instead of info level, which is why we see that extra bit of information here. If you got any questions on app factory pattern or initialization or CLI integration, how that works, go ahead and post that now. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next topic, but I'll try to come back and answer questions once I've got a little bit into configuration. So how do you configure an application? Again, if you look at the hello world stuff from Flask, the simple way is to do something like this. App.config SQL something. So that's how it's going to tell you how to do config. In the real world, though, while that might work for some default settings, a lot of times the values that we want to change, we're going to want to change them per environment. So the developer's environment is probably going to be a little bit different than the CI environment is. The CI environment is going to be a little bit different than the production value or than the production systems are. Sometimes you have more than one deployed system. You might be deploying beta containers or beta applications. You might be deploying production applications. And in those cases, some of your values, especially connection strings to external services like the database that I'm using, that stuff's going to be different in each environment. And so the question becomes, what's the best way to set configuration values in an application in a way that gives you flexibility per environment and per app? So ideally, you'd like to come up with a pattern of how to set application values that would work, for most of your use cases. And so I have come up over the years with a few ways that I usually set application environment, application configuration, and I've kind of baked that here into our application. And so we're going to open up config, and we're just going to talk about the 3 ways. So there's a library in here to help us do that. And so the first way is to simply have some default configuration set up for the application. This is actually, I'm going to show you something. This is really in the wrong place right now. I'd like this to actually be we're in the library. So we're in flog libs config. This should really be flog.config, and there should be some default configuration in there. I did this kind of the wrong way to start with, and I didn't have it. I didn't have time to finish it. But default config is a way to just set up what are all those default configurations. Some people would just end up putting those in the app. So there isn't necessarily anything wrong, for instance, to come in here when you're doing init app, and maybe instead of calling this init config, you just do self here is the application instance. I could just do self.config, and I could start setting my values here. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I'm actually working to break out this pattern into a library. And so some of this code that you're looking at is going to eventually work its way into a library that I publish. And so you just wouldn't put it here. So I've got it, separated off. But the 3 ways that I envision getting configuration is going to be default configurations built into the application. So I'm setting these in the app. They're going to be this way every time. They're the same for every environment that I operate in, whether it's development or production. And I'm going to set those values up. I'm going to hard code them in the application. Okay, the second way that I'm usually going to get configuration is through a file on the file system. And so I set up a hierarchy that allows me to set those files at various levels based on the needs of the application. So the first one here you'll see is going to be the app name. So my app name here is flog. So I could find a configuration file in etc flog config.py. I could also find it in my user directory. So I'm using the apters package, which for what we're doing here is going to resolve to, something like my home directory .config, and that's going to be this user config directory. Oh, I'm sorry, flog, because we've passed in the app name here. So basically just following the same pattern as etc. So it's going to be flog config.py. And then I also have another file here at the end that's actually in the root. And that's how I end up doing almost all of my configuration for my web applications, is I just drop a file in the root directory of the project that has my default configuration in it. This normally doesn't get committed. It's committed here for the purposes of this tutorial. Normally we have an example. So this would be flog-config-example.py, and then your developer instructions would say, hey, copy that file to start from scratch. So that's the third, so that's the third file that I would use. So the first method is default hard-coded values. The second method is config files that are on the file system. And then the third way is to actually get them from the environment. So we've got a little routine here that looks through all the environment variables. And if there happens to be an environment variable that starts with the prefix that the app name is, so in this case, it would be flog _ something. I can show you an example of that in my tox file. I have to set something special for tox. So I disable syslog in tox for CI. And so anytime I have a flog _ something in the current environment, I'll automatically chop off that part of it and set this value as the configuration value. So I can show you some tests for that on how that works. So when if I had foo bar in and it was set to Baz, and I run the configuration environment and I tell it to look for the prefix foo, then Baz gets pulled out of the environment and set to the bar variable. This part gets set to this part. So a pretty easy, relatively flexible system for basically getting environment variables in whatever sane way that you want to. If you follow 12-factor applications, they recommend everything be set up environment variables. We find that that gets a bit unwieldy. We'd rather have configuration files that just get deployed as part of the system. So you know, your mileage may vary. All right, let's see, configuration. The other thing to know is that if you look at our requirements file, we install python.env. That is in order to read environment files. So Flask will pick up a .env or a .flask-env. Technically, .env is supposed to be for development and not committed. Flask-env is supposed to be for to be committed as part of the application. Again, I wouldn't use a Flask-env because I would use any default configuration for me would go in the configuration file. But just want to make you aware of these, you know, of these options for setting environment variables using files as well. From files, from environment, alternate settings. So yeah, you'll see that too. I like to be able to set different configuration based on the development environment that we're in. And so that is part of that configuration setup, that it knows what environment it's in and it will load it. So for instance, when I'm in the development environment, this is the configuration that gets called. When I'm in the testing environment, this is the configuration that gets called. And if you're interested, you can kind of see where that's set up. So the testing environment value is set up here. When we're testing, we're going to start this. We're going to set the environment variable. This is the only Flask configuration value that I'm aware of that you really need to set as an environment value instead of being able to set it on the config later. And there's some docs in Flask that talk about why. But basically, the problem is when you instantiate the Flask app here, it does some stuff that checks this environment variable. So if you change it later, it's just you're going to be too late. You're beyond the time when it matters. And then Flask-env gets sent to development by that .env file that I showed you. So this is how it gets sent to development. And so then that controls which one of these functions get called to set up the environment. Okay. I'm going to skip that for now since I'm almost out of time. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I've got logging and testing. I'm just going to run through here. You can look at the logging code that's there. In general, the way that I like to do things for logs is that info level logs should always go to standard out if you're on the command line, or they should go to a centralized logging service. A lot of people are concerned about logging too much. I think logs are relatively cheap. Anything, you know, I think there's a difference between debug logging, which is very verbose, and then info logging, which I think we tend towards info logging being minimal, and I think info logging should probably tend a bit more towards verbosity. I'd rather have more information in the application about what's going on than less. So I make liberal use of .info logs. And I set up the logging so that that goes to standard out if I'm running a command line app, or it goes to syslog and then ends up in our log aggregation server for the web servers. The other thing is that the stuff that goes to syslog is logged in JSON format, and our log aggregation service knows how to kind of take that apart. So if you look at so you'll see if this was one of my servers, this log line would then go to a centralized log server, and that would all that data would be parsed out and ready to be easily queryable. And I forget what we use Logzio service. I forget, that's an open source project kind of underneath the hood that they use. that I can't remember the name of right now, but it's really helpful to be able to look through logs that way. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just not going to have time to get into that. I can move the conversation. I think Mary Beth, are we at a point where we should move the conversation to the other room that you got set up?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can head over to the gallery. I will put that link in the Flask channel as well as track 2. So that is a regular Zoom meeting. So if you want to, anybody listening, turn on your cameras, put your mics on. That way Randy can actually hear you. You can ask some more questions and get some more information. So I will stop this stream right now. We will head over there.
Sounds good. Thank you.